Hello and welcome to the True Mass Games YouTube channel. Happy Halloween! And as it is Halloween, we are playing a horror one-shot today, a rather unusual one. The system is a fairly little-known one called Don't Walk in Winter Woods. It's basically a folklore horror setting, set in sort of the 16th, 17th, 18th century in North America. Maybe a little akin to the style of movies like Season of the Witch or Blair Witch Project and similar ones. I have added a link to the download if you want to check the system out on Drive Through RPG. It's at the bottom of the video. The system itself, without explaining it in too much detail, is very simple. Basically, our player characters are rolling only 1d6, and they have something that is called cold tokens, which represent physical or mental trauma or stress that their characters are receiving. And to succeed in any roll, they need to roll above the current number of cold tokens that they have. So if they have 3 cold tokens, they need to roll a 4, 5, or a 6 on the d6 to succeed. If they have ever accumulate 6 cold tokens, they are out of the game. They go crazy, they die, whatever happens. That, of course, means that you can go out of the game rather quickly with a few bad rolls, and as the cold tokens accumulate, because it makes more and more likely for your character to fail a check, obviously, as the cold tokens accumulate. That's really all the rules you need to know, and that's pretty much all the rules there are, really. There are 2 more very important parts to this setting, this rule system as such. Don't Walk in Winter Woods seeks to emulate old horror stories that you tell around the campfire. So basically, you know that story when someone tells you about this guy that he heard about that walked into the forest and never came back? That's the sort of story we are telling today, basically. To achieve this, we are using 2 narrative techniques that I usually don't use in my role-playing games. Firstly, we are speaking in past tense. We are not speaking in present tense. So it's not I go into the clearing and look around. It is, I don't know, Andrew walked out into the clearing looking around. This is what a player would say. So he's talking about his character in past tense and in third person. It is as if the players are not actually the characters in the game itself. Instead, it is as if they are narrating someone else's adventures. They're telling a ghost story, basically, about this guy that they knew that ventured into the forest. This is exactly how it works. We'll see how that actually goes in the very game. This will be a bit unusual for all of us, I'm sure, but we'll try our best to succeed. And that's pretty much all you need to know. Everything else, you will see in the game itself. Let's jump straight in. As this is a horror game, of course, we are trying to build up a bit of an atmosphere. So if you want to enjoy this fully, maybe dim the lights or switch off the lights in your room, open up the window for the full experience, get some cold air in, and put a blanket over yourself, shiver a bit, and that's the very right mood that you want to be in for such an adventure. Now, once in the year of our Lord, 1710, somewhere in the very, very distant and massive woods, the deep forests of North America, there was a village. The village was known as the village of Hollow Lake. And sometime in that year, actually on the very last and darkest evening of that year, on All Hallows Eve, there were 4 men traveling in a small wagon pulled by an old horse, traveling towards Hollow Lake. The 4 men had met each other on the road a few days prior, and they had decided to travel together for that last leg of the journey. All 4 men had decided to make Hollow Lake this tiny village somewhere deep in the forests, this village surrounded by weird rumors and dark legends, to make this village their new home. Some of them were seeking a new beginning. Others were seeking to prove themselves. Others again might have had entirely different motives. The fact is, once upon a time, so to speak, 4 men were traveling the forests, looking for the village of Hollow Lake. It had been raining heavily over the course of the last days of this autumn afternoon, and the rain had drenched the forests and the road, which had become muddy and hard to pass through. The men had misjudged the distance between the last settlement that they had left and the village of Hollow Lake. They were meant to arrive around noon or so, but the roads were bad. The cart, this wagon that they were traveling on, became stuck again and again, and the men were starting to become nervous as it was getting darker and colder. As we are jumping into the game, the men only had maybe an hour, maybe a little more left of daylight. They all had heard weird stories about these woods, known as winter wood, amongst the local population, and none of them was looking forward to spending the night within these woods, even not counting potential dangers like bears and wolves, and the cold, of course, for the winter wood bore its name with pride. It was a cold, dark, and deep wood, not seeing the thread of a civilized man's boot very often. And this is where we are jumping into the game. A few hours before the sun sets on All Hallows Eve in the year of our Lord 1710. As always in my games, I will give the player characters the chance to introduce themselves in a bit of a more specific way this time, as these 4 men were sitting on the wagon, maybe huddled together a bit, maybe not, and following the road, this muddy, narrow path with the deep, dark woods, quiet, cold, waiting and watching to both sides of this road. Let's start with Zachariah Throckmorton, played by Neil tonight. Go ahead.
Zechariah was a man with a look in his eyes as if only he got the joke. From his black tricorn hat, made of slightly tatty velvet, the rain dripped into his eyes constantly. His long hair, pulled back in a ponytail, was greying, as was his neatly trimmed beard. He wore a bright green long coat with what at first might have been taken for gold buttons, but were clearly brass. He carried with him a large leather travelling trunk, the contents of which he was cagey about, to say the least. More boring parts of the journey, he practiced the cup and ball routine and the 3-card Monty, and now was thoroughly fed up, wet and cold.
Indeed, and that was Zachariah Throckmorton, one of the 4 travelers on the road on this autumn afternoon. Jumping over to Sir Francis Nesbitt, the 2nd man on this wagon. Stephen? Hello? Sir Francis seems to be having audio issues. No, we cannot hear you, sorry. We'll move over to Julius then, and Mr. Arthur Scott for now.
Yes. Tonight I'm telling the story of Arthur Scott, a young, rather pale, gentleman. He's huddled in his long grey cloak, obviously shivering, not used to the cold. He seemed very out of place here on traveling at all. He's very scared, but also quite interested in the woods. He seems to take a mental note of his surrounding. He seems to take, sorry.
That's okay, I know.
Past tense is still...
Yes, past tense, especially we're not native English speaking.
Yeah.
Can be a bit more tricky than usual. Okay, excellent. And that was Arthur Scott, the second of the men on this wagon in the middle of the woods. Stephen?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Perfect. Continue on, please. Sir Francis Nesbitt.
So Sir Francis Nesbitt, by all intents and purposes, was a very ordinary man. He came from a noble bloodline. And you could tell that he did, in fact, come from money based on the fact that he always carried this cane with him. The cane shone with silver top, and the ornament on the top of the cane was carved into the shape of a raven. And he always used it. As on the journey, you would see him use it, tap it, kind of move it around. The only other thing you noticed about Sir Francis was that he liked his drink. Throughout the journey, he would pull out a silver flask and see if anyone in the cart would like a drink, especially with the weather. But you could tell that he didn't really care for this rain and that he was used to more accommodating environments. And he didn't like the fact that his coat, his well-trimmed, expensive coat, was getting wet. And his nerves were a little frayed from being out in the cold so long.
The rain had stopped a few hours ago, but the road is still drenched, and so were the coats of our travelers. And speaking of them, the last of the 4 men on this wagon was Matthew Higgins. Go ahead, Ignacio. That's your turn.
Matthew Higgins was sitting in the back, and he was facing the right side, but he would often steal glimpses to his left and to his right. He seemed to be very unsettled, although he was almost simultaneously nervous and bored by the landscape. He was expecting something different. He's heard stories about the New World, and given that he had always wanted to find something and in a different land than his native England, he thought of visiting the Orient, but realized that going to the New World would be much more affordable.
Okay, seems to be some minor audio issues there.
For the past,
you mind rejoining as well, Ignacio? Maybe it'll fix up. You seem to be dropping out a bit while you're talking.
A few hours, he's been muttering under his breath. Orient.
Yeah, okay. Let's hope these audio issues don't persist too much during the game. But technology is generally a little tricky when it comes to atmospheric games. So we'll see how that works tonight. It is obviously quite different when you are sitting in your own house with a few candles and a few friends. But we'll do the best that we can. We'll make the best that we can from this. Okay, let's see.
All right,
hopefully the connection is better now. Sorry?
Is that better?
Yes, it seems to be clearer. Okay, let's hope
that
great. It holds up. Okay, so these were our 4 men on this wagon. They were tired, some grumpy, wet, as the horse was tired and grumpy and wet, its hoofs sliding through the mud. Rain had been falling for days. It had stopped a few hours ago. The road was hard to travel. The four men knew that they were supposed to come upon Hollow Lake eventually. There was only the one road as far as they knew. So as long as they would stick to that, they would make it eventually. And as they were traveling down the road, and the minutes were slipping by them, very much noticed as the sun slowly disappearing behind the dense trees of the forest, which were bearing very few leaves, despite the relatively early autumn season. They came upon a little clearing in the forest, and they could hear sounds in the distance, sounds that for once cut through the silence of winter woods. The sounds were wind, the croaking of ravens, and what sounded like water, not too far away, maybe a stream or a river or some such. The horse stopped, bending down to nibble on a small bit of grass protruding from the side of the road. The four men did not know why the horse had stopped. Maybe it was just tired, maybe it was getting lazy and needed a break. The men were not sure, but the fact was the horse had stopped.
Zechariah cast around for the horsewhip, determined he was not going to spend another night in this miserable countryside.
His hand found the horsewhip quite ready, lying at his side. The horse, ears pricking up at the sound of the whip, just being touched, looked up and cast one big, stupid-looking eye back onto Zechariah. The horse, maybe not so stupid after all, continued onwards without needing the whip. And as soon as it did continue, the four men saw this, where the sound of water was coming from. Maybe about 50 yards down the road, there was a river, a small one, or one small anyway, for the river had swollen. There were large puddles of water on both sides of the river, and it looked like the river had torn apart pieces of shrubbery, some small trees on the side, and most tragically of all, also a small wooden bridge that had once marked a crossing here. It seemed like there was not much left of this wooden bridge, except for a few pieces of timber and what looked to be a single street sign, also made of wood, jotted and jabbed into the ground, not too far away from the river, however, on the opposite side of the water, where the road continued on. The horse continued for another 20, 30 yards, and then maybe 15, 20 yards from the water, it came to a hesitant stop, unsure what to do.
Sir Francis Nesbitt got out of the cart and walked to the edge where the water was, and using his cane, he went to test to see how deep the water actually ran.
So Francis realized very soon that the edge of the water was quite dangerous. Mud that was could easily give way underfoot and throw someone into the river. The water was cold, and the current seemed rather strong. The river seemed angry, swollen with all the water from the rain of the last 3 or 4 days. A strong swimmer might have made it across the river, which was, after all, only about 25, 30 yards wide. But there was no way a cart or anyone who was trying to keep belongings at his side would have been able to make it across. However, Sir Francis saw two things as he was standing at the river. One, a sign on the other side. It had carved into the wood simple letters and an arrow pointing further down the road. Hollow Lake, 5 miles. The second thing he noticed, however, was a small side road, nearly hidden by bushes, winding its way into the forest on the right side, seemingly going upriver.
Seeing these, Sir Francis walked back to the cart and explained to the other three gentlemen that we could travel 5 miles to the lake, or we could perchance see where this side road goes, and left it up to the group to decide.
Zechariah glanced at the swollen stream ahead of them, more at his large and seemingly precious leather traveling case perched on the back of the wagon. "Seems to me, gentlemen," he said, "that we are as well advised to see where this small road goes. Perhaps it leads to another bridge."
Indeed, Matthew said. And a small smile crept on his face for the first time in the evening. It seems like, as the Buddha of the Orient said, become the path, and now we must follow it to reach our destination.
Arthur Scott looked like he didn't really agree with the group, but was too nervous to object, so he just nodded slightly and kept to himself.
So the men approached the path, and they realized the little side trail, and they realized very quickly that the cart, the wagon as it were, would be a narrow fit, but with some slow going, it would be possible. This side road was covered by tree branches overhead, interlocked, forming nearly like a rooftop over the path, and therefore the path was less muddy and less rain tormented than the main road, as it were. As they carefully made their way, wagon and all, into this shadow of the trees, they all felt the cold. Maybe it was just the fatigue of the journey catching up to them, and now this newest obstacle slowly weakening their spirits, or maybe it was something about this place surrounding. And as they were traveling down this path, even just the first couple of yards, they felt the cold seep into their bones. And all the 4 men shuddered briefly. They continued down this road, with the sun still slowly sinking. For maybe another 10 minutes or so, not very long anyway, moving slowly, about as slow as a man on foot would be moving, but the cart, of course, necessary to carry their belongings. And then they came upon another obstacle, as if fate was mocking them. There was a tree, seemingly fallen across the road, blocking the path. A large tree, but not massive enough to be a specific obstacle for a human, a man on foot. But for the wagon, for the horse, unless someone pushed the tree away, chopped it up, there was no way that it could pass.
God's blood, swore Zechariah. If we're out here after dark, we're going to end up on a spit for some savages. Shall we get to it, gentlemen?
Arthur said, "Well, I doubt that I'll be much of help, but I can try. Yes." Looking rather unsure.
Well, let's get
Zechariah,
to it.
with fake bonhomie, clapped him on the shoulder and handed him a small axe.
He remarked, that should do the trick. Thank you. And he left the cart and started going over to the...
Okay. As Arthur left the cart and, hatchet in hand, approached this tree, he noticed very quickly that this tree was not a victim of the storm, as might have been assumed. One side of the tree showed clear signs of a woodsman's axe. It seemed as if someone had chopped this tree down rather recently, in fact. Maybe on the same day or the day before, not far back, not further past that. And even while Arthur was gazing at this, thinking of whether he should mention this to his companions, he saw something else. A small light, a distant light, pushing its way ever so slightly through the trees ahead. What looked like the light of a lantern or maybe a campfire, but maybe 100 or 150 yards distant, further down or up the road, as you wish to speak.
Arthur quickly turned around to the group and remarked, "Oh, there's light over there. Maybe someone can help us. Maybe we are not that far from the town."
Sink me, sir, said Zechariah. We're on the wrong side of the river for that, surely. We should be cautious, he remarked. These are dangerous and ill-favored woodlands.
Be mindful, young man, Matthew said, of optical illusions and the like. Many insects give off a luminescence. Are you sure that this is a lantern? Surely it is late and in the woods. Who would wander at this time?
He seemed rather shaken by the remarks of his fellow companions. Not sure what to think of the light he's seeing. Well, maybe you should take a look. I'm not used to this. You seem to be much more experienced.
Francis shook his head and laughed and said, "I'll take a look." And he reached back in the cart to pull out what appeared to be a single-shot pistol and walked back to check to see where this light was.
Francis realized very soon that to see further into the forest, he would either have to step through the muddy, dense underbrush growing on both sides of the road, or he would have to make his way across this tree, slippery and wet as it were, and continue further down the road to approach this light, whatever it was. Or try to remove the tree, of course, and then continue his path with his companions on the wagon.
Looking back at his companions, he says, "Well, if we move the tree, we can get closer to whatever this light is. But we have to move the tree first."
I believe it will take all four of us. Look at the size of the thing. And Matthew got down over the side of the wagon and approached the trunk.
So Matthew and Sir Francis were standing there, looking up at Arthur and Zechariah, who were still sitting on the wagon. The horse, unperturbed by everything, seemed to have been sniffing the ground, ignoring the men.
Arthur quickly joined the two, even though he was not sure if he was of any help. But he didn't want to leave his companions behind with this task.
So the three of them were now trying to push the tree out of the way. Did they succeed? Scott seemed to be doing quite well. Arthur Scott seemed to be doing quite well despite his frail frame. Matthew Higgins was helping quite well. And Sir Francis, with the combined strength of the three men, the tree started to move. With Zechariah still sitting on the wagon watching, as his three companions slowly but surely, over the course of the next 5 minutes or so, managed to push this tree aside far enough for the wagon to be able to squeeze its way past. As they were doing so, the horse seemed suddenly to become nervous. They realized that it was looking around, its ears flat against the side of its head. And Zechariah, also looking around, spotted something in the brush on the side. Zechariah's gaze, piercing through the shadows of approaching night amongst the bushes, fell upon a figure standing there and watching. A brief moment, Zechariah caught a glimpse of a pale face, a woman apparently, with long dark hair, standing there amongst the bushes, looking, watching, unmoving.
Zechariah was caught between his desire to control the horse and prevent it bolting and his morbid fascination with this curious figure. In the end, he opted to try to seize the reins and prevent his precious luggage being dragged off into the night.
Zechariah reached for the reins, holding them tight, trying to control the horse. Did he succeed? He pulled the reins, the horse calming down a bit, looking back at him. And as he looked up, his companions just pushing the tree out of the way, the woman seemed gone. No trace of her presence left, as far as Zechariah could see. It did not seem that any of his companions had noticed this figure, if it was there at all, and not just a trick of his eyes and the weird, slightly twisting shadows of encroaching night.
Gentlemen, Zechariah struggled manfully to keep the quaver out of his voice. We are perhaps not alone out here.
What do you mean, Zechariah, my friend? Surely we are never completely alone. There is a great spirit of nature that surrounds us. But I doubt you are being so poetic. What do you mean?
A figure yonder in the trees regarding us, I felt, without good intentions.
Sir Francis laughs. Oh, Balderdash, you all are just getting the heebie-jeebies from being out in the cold too long. We've got the tree out of the way. I suggest we make our way along. quickly. We don't want to be out longer than we have to.
Moving on does sound like a good idea, and Arthur Scott quickly leapt onto the wagon.
Certainly does, and Matthew got onto the wagon himself, but he sat next to Zechariah and continued to pry him with questions. Was it a Christian man like you and me? And he smiles for a moment, or was it one of the natives that people this savage land?
I had not the time to make accurate observation. It seemed to me a female form, but pale of complexion, almost unnaturally so. But they tell me the savages hereabout are dusky-hued, not pale as this creature was.
Yes, I've heard much the same. Earthy, reddish tones like desert rocks. Mayhap the reflection of the moonlight made her seem that way.
Perhaps. But I like it not here in the cold. At this rate, even if there are only savages awaiting us at this yonder light, I think I'd prefer their company to hers. Onward, onward, gentlemen. Zechariah lashed gently at the horse's sides with the reins.
The horse gave a and slowly pushing past the trunk of the tree, the wagon continued on its path up the road, which slightly curled to the right, away from the river, which was maybe about 150 yards to the left of our travelers. But they very soon emerged from the forest onto a clearing, and they immediately realized where the light was coming from. For on that clearing stood a hut, overshadowed by a massive willow tree, rising right behind the hut, but 10 yards or so distant. The hut itself was made of wood, but looking quite sturdy, and the light of seemingly a single lantern was shining from a single window at the front of the hut, betraying the presence of civilization. This was no dwelling of savages by any means. Surely the hand of a white man had built this dwelling. And as the horse had stopped and the four travelers were gazing upon the house, darkness fell. And another chill struck the group as the temperature seemed to be dropping rather quickly, faster even than the sun disappearing beyond the distant mountains.
Wonderful. We might have an abode for the night. Shall we approach these strangers?
Without waiting for the consensus, Zechariah jumped down from the wagon, jogged across the muddy ground, fully intending to bang on the door and demand shelter. The cold spurring him on.
Zechariah leapt down, threaded towards the front door, sturdy and made of oak. He arrived unchallenged. The house was quiet, with no movement coming from inside.
Matthew left off the cart and followed close behind, long in privately for a conversation from other people.
So Francis and Arthur Scott were left behind on the cart with the horse momentarily. The horse itself did not seem to know what to make of this scene. It just stood there, waiting for some sort of signal, one way or the other.
While the others went to the door, Arthur started to rummage through his belongings and try to find something to take with him into the house. Maybe some food, something to drink, to share with the housekeepers.
Certainly, yes. His hands fell on provisions for the road, provisions that should last another day or two at least, and a small bottle of strong spirit that he could not actually remember packing. Maybe it belonged to one of his companions. Maybe it was something mistakenly ending up on the cart. Arthur was not quite sure.
Sir Francis looked back and said, "Save the spirits for later. I brought that along for when I arrived in my new home." And then Sir Francis got up into the driver's seat to make sure that, nothing should happen to the horse. It shouldn't take off and buck us from the cart. Waiting to see what Zachariah and them found from the home.
All right. Zachariah and Matthew were standing in front of this hut, looking at each other, looking back at the sturdy oaken door, the unmoving hut. Single window at the front.
Zechariah banged impatiently on the door. "Open up, sir!" he cried. "Open up!"
The banging was loud in the quiet of the woods. A moment passed. Another. No sound emerged from the hut. Maybe abandoned, maybe not.
Matthew attempted to peek through the window and see what was beneath.
The window was shut with heavy wooden bars, but there were a few slits in the bars that allowed a bit of light to filter through. As Matthew Higgins was pressing his face against the bars, trying to peek through with one eye to see what was behind it. Did he succeed on that?
Certainly did. And what did he see?
He saw apparently some sort of living room with a part of a kitchen area with a small fireplace. A tiny bit of smoke curling up from the fireplace and a single lantern hanging from the ceiling on a simple bronze hook. There was also a table there, and there was a few things on the table, but from his position, Matthew Higgins could not quite make out what the objects were. He also saw another door leading to the back of the house, apparently. A room at the back of the house or some such. He did not see anyone in this room.
Try the handle, my good man. I think there's somebody in the house or was here very recently, and if we're lucky, perhaps it is not locked.
Zechariah, needing no second invitation, tried the door.
The door swung open with a quiet sound. Despite being quite heavy, the door seemed surprisingly easy to open. Light spilled out, falling onto Zechariah's features. He blinked a bit, now already used to the twilight and the semi-darkness, the dim light of the forest. A little bit of smoke and a slightly herbal scent rose into Zechariah's and Matthew Higgins' noses.
Zechariah pondered, trying to place that herbal scent.
Did he succeed?
He did.
He was not quite sure what the scent was. It reminded him of freshly cut grass in some ways, but there was a slightly more exotic odor to it as well. He assumed it must be some local herb that he was not familiar with.
Casting aside doubt, Zechariah stepped into the welcome warmth of the building.
As he stepped in, he saw the floor was made of dirt, but packed and strong, covered with a small cloth. There was a small kitchen area on the right side, a fireplace with what looked to be a small cauldron hanging over it. And there was something, some sort of broth or something, bubbling away quietly in this cauldron, which is where the scent was coming from. There was a door leading towards the back end of the house, and there was a table. And on this table stood, burning and smoking ever so slightly, a single candle. And around this candle, in a vague circular pattern, Zechariah's gaze fell upon what looked to be stick figures, doll-like shapes of small twigs tied together with a small rope or a leather band, 5 or 6 of them, forming a vague circle around the candle. He also saw what at first he perceived to be shadows on one side of the ceiling, but then revealed itself to be 3 skinned rabbits or other small animals of the forest hanging upside down from this part of the ceiling.
Zechariah smiled indulgently at what he took to be children's toys on the table, called out, "Hello! Weary travelers here. Anyone? Hello?"
Zechariah's voice boomed through the silence. The house...
It was at this moment that Matthew came in the door.
They both were listening. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. Did they hear anything?
Matthew did.
As did Zechariah.
They both heard something, but not what they expected. They heard a ticking sound, like some sort of clock. Tick, tick, tick. A rhythmic and unchanging, seemingly coming from the other side of the house, this second room, or further rooms at the back. Although they both figured that the house probably would not have more than the 2 rooms from the size that they had seen from the outside. And as they were entering the house, Arthur Scott and Sir Francis Nesbitt were seeing their companions entering and calling out, and they did not hear any reply. It seemed as if the house was abandoned, despite some things that might be telling our travelers otherwise.
Maybe we should stay back for now and guard our belongings. I trust our companions will do well in this house. They should. I'm sure they will call us in if everything's fine.
Sir Francis nods his head and says, "Doesn't mean we can't move the cart and the horse closer to the door. I mean, if it's abandoned and we're going to stay here tonight, I don't want to have to lug everything out of the cart and all the way up there."
That makes sense. Yes. Let's do so.
They both pulled had the horse pull the cart closer, and they did see that there was a few pieces of lumber protruding from the side of the house that might be well suited for tying up a horse to it. The horse would have had no protection from the elements there, but at least it would not be able to run away. Would not have been able to run away. Zechariah and Matthew were standing in the living room now, or this living room kitchen, gazing around, and they did notice something that they had not noticed before. On the floor, there were what looked to be muddy footprints, fairly fresh, apparently. Boot prints, or some sort of shoes, fairly large in their size.
Matthew seemed immediately transfixed by the contents of the cauldron and the dolls made of twigs. He attempted to smell the cauldron itself, trying to ascertain what was in it.
Did he succeed?
He did.
Smelling the cauldron, Matthew felt a brief moment of vertigo. It seemed like some sort of broth, definitely some type of food, maybe dinner for whoever was usually dwelling in this home, but there was something to it that put Matthew off slightly. The scent of some sort of vaguely exotic herb or other part of the broth that did not seem familiar.
I shall be trying this, but perhaps a moment later. And then he approached the candle and the small dolls, trying to remember if there was something about what he read about the magical arts. He had heard about the rituals of the slaves in the West Indies, and he had heard about what the priests did in the Orient. He certainly read a lot about it, though he lacked a lot of practical experience.
Matthew was trying to pull out some sort of knowledge half buried under many, many different books from the side of his brain whilst he was thinking. Was there something coming forth?
Yes, an idea pierced through.
The idea came to Matthew Higgins' mind. He had seen these primitive dolls before. He had seen the children, both of natives in this land and of the white settlers, men of Christianity, play with these simple stick figures made by their parents and sometimes by children themselves. He had heard of a tradition, local and otherwise, to give such dolls to children on their name days. But he had also heard darker stories of weird rituals, magical practices, dark magic, shunned by all true believers in God and his ways, of course, that seemed to be connected to such figures. And the positioning the dolls, these figures with the candle on the table, struck him as odd, at least, if not suspicious.
Matthew tried to overcome his curiosity, but it was too much. He pocketed one of the dolls and put it in his large overcoat. As he admired the candle, was the candle lit?
The candle was lit, yes. It was a rather large candle, about maybe 5 or 6 inches thick, and maybe about 15 or so inches high, made of some slightly sweet-smelling wax, and lit, indeed, giving off a little bit of smoke that curled up and disappeared amongst the shadows of the ceiling. The figure, the stick figure, as Matthew's hand clutched it, felt very light, made of twigs, a little rotten and old. Matthew realized very quickly that this was not something recently made, something that might have been in use for a few years at least. It also felt a little damp, as if it had been wet fairly recently, as they had come into contact with water, rain, or something like that.
He then attempted to smell the little figure. As he noticed it being damp, he wondered if it had been wet in the concoction that he found in the cauldron.
It did not smell like the concoction, no. It had no specific smell other than the faint odor of slightly rotten wood.
Rather odd. Zechariah, don't you think we are a ways away from the islands of the Caribbean, yet these figures remind me of the strange mixed Christian African cults in there?
Zechariah, whose attention had been on the muddy footprints leading across the room, jumped as he was addressed. I'm sorry, what?
The stick figures, the twigs, seems like some kind of religious practice, don't you think? And yet the candle, it seems, well, it reminds me of a church candle.
It did actually. It reminded both of them of a church candle, very much so.
I have not been in a church since I was 7 years old, sir. But yes, indeed, it seems familiar. But I wonder whether we may want to perhaps see if we are indeed alone here. And Zechariah indicated the muddy footprints leading across the room towards the other door.
Ah, yes.
And it was at this point Sir Francis stuck his head in. Gentlemen, you have been in here an excessive amount of time. Have you found our hosts? What is the deal?
Zechariah turned with a start. I think we were just about to ensure that the property is indeed empty as it appears, sir. And he gestured towards the door at the far end of the room.
Sir Francis nodded and replied back, "Then I shall go tether the horse and tell our other young compatriot to stay with our belongings till we decide if we're staying or going. But we do need to make a choice soon. It is getting darker and colder the longer we sit here."
Where have you left the cart, my good friend? Is it within sight of the door to this hut?
It's right outside. It's by the hut. It's by the cabin. There's a place to tie the horse, and the cart's pulled up outside.
Well, the cart without the horse can hardly be pulled away by men. Quickly, I say all we need to do is keep an eye on it. Tell the young man to come in as well. He shouldn't be out there in the cold. He seems to be of poor constitution.
Sir Francis nods and then heads back out to finish tying up the horse, release the wagon from the horse, and bring his young compatriot inside.
So Francis stepped out. He did what he intended to do, and he took Arthur by the shoulders, and both of them carrying a few of their belongings, they made their way into the room. While Zechariah and Matthew were waiting, they were still gazing around this living room and kitchen area.
Goodness, this is a curious room. I've noticed. I don't think I recognize the smell. Interesting. Have you found anything?
Zechariah, not really knowing why, almost tiptoed to the other door, examined it.
It seemed a simple wooden door, not nearly as sturdy as the one outside.
He lifted the latch.
The door was opened.
And opened the door. Peered in.
There was a change in the atmosphere of the house, nearly unperceivable by the men, but still something that told them to be careful. And now suddenly there was a ticking sensation, a ticking sound coming from the darkness of the back room of this house, like the ticking of a clock. Maybe it was the ticking of a clock, maybe it was something else. The men were not sure, but the ticking drew their attention towards the door as Zechariah had opened it a little bit. And then there was something else, something curious. A strange music. A few notes seemingly accompanying the ticking, also coming from this room. The room itself seemed dark, except for the little bit of light, like a thin blade of grass reaching across the floor now from the lantern, still hanging in the room behind Zechariah's back now.
It was at that moment that Matthew produced from his overcoat a very small lamp, like something out of the Arabian Nights. And he poured a little bit of oil in it, from a small flask and lit it with the candle, and said, "I believe when entering a room you've never been in, one should carry a light, wouldn't you say, my friend?" And checking to see that the figurine was still in his clothes,
It was.
as he didn't want to lose it.
It was very much still in there.
He would peer and take a few paces into the other room.
Did Zechariah let him pass?
Zechariah, feigning an insouciance he didn't quite feel, took off his hat and with an ironic flourish bowed low as he opened the door further to allow his companion to pass.
Matthew Higgins stepped into the second room, the light in his hand shining brightly, like an intruder, pushing the darkness back. His gaze fell upon the floor first, wooden floorboards covered by a thick rug, some sort of animal fur apparently, but cunningly prepared. The next, there was a large bed, unmade, and on that bed there were several blankets and a hunting rifle, gleaming with a bit of metal in the lantern light. He immediately spotted where the ticking was coming from, for there was a large clock seemingly out of place in this cabin, far away from any civilization, really, in the middle of the woods on this wild land. The clock was ticking faintly, and it seemed modern. Not quite new, maybe, but surprisingly modern. And then there was this weird music that drew Matthew Higgins' eyes to the left, towards the far side of the bed. And there he saw what he had maybe seen before, but never really up close. A wooden box, partially open, like a jewelry box. And he realized where the music was coming from was one of those French boxes, those toy boxes with a little dancing lady that was turning round and round on a clockwork. Strange, nearly exotic, certainly surprising sight, this far away from the glamours of France. There was also a door that seemed to be leading outside to the back of the house, closed, with a small window next to it that was barred.
Nobody home, it seems. Perhaps it is my curious nature, but admire this little French doll, Zechariah. You can come in. There is nobody here. Just well, a lot of things seem out of place here. A strange collection of objects. If I may, I say the person who lived here is a sort of collector.
Zechariah, not quite summoning up the courage to step into the room, peered around the door so he could take it in. Indeed, master, but I am not familiar with this French artistry and clockwork. But it seems to me that the owner cannot be far away, since it is still making music, no?
Arthur quickly followed into the room after he heard talk about this French box, and went to look closer at it, as he had heard about these contraptions, but hasn't ever looked at one close. He wondered how it worked.
Arthur saw the box was half open, the lid sort of open up a little bit, and he saw this silhouette of a ballerina, a dancing woman, seemingly turning by herself. And the music seemed to be also coming ever so faintly, these few notes, stuttering nearly, from this box. He did not really understand, but he figured that there must have been some sort of clockwork or some such, keeping this little figurine moving. A strange thing, a modern thing.
Yes, my young lad, it is much in the way that that clock over there is working, seemingly with nothing animating it. Science advances more than the eye can see it. I've seen one of these before, but it was at a place that you've probably never been to, and that's a good thing, my lad, because it was a place of ill repute.
Sir Francis Nesbitt, now left alone in the front room, was looking around. What was he doing?
So Francis went to the kitchen looking for a cup
He found
and decided to pour himself a drink and warm himself by the fire. He'd been out too long in the cold, and all he really wanted right now was some warmth.
Did he close the door behind him, the door leading outside, which was still standing wide open?
As he grabbed his drink and he walks back, he noticed the door was still open, and with his foot, he closed the door.
The door fell with a weirdly final sounding thump and was closed. Sir Francis also heard now this weird music that made the hair and the back of his neck stand up for some reason. So seemingly out of place in this hut. But he also heard this quiet conversation of his traveling companions from the other room and realized very quickly where this music was coming from.
Peeking his head through the door, Sir Francis looked around. What are you all doing in this room? What is so interesting? And where is that bloody music coming from?
It is coming from this little contraption, the clockwork box, I think. I don't know how it works, but it seems to be the source of the music.
Fine thing. Imported it must be. Tell me, said Matthew. Sir Francis, have you done much hunting in your day? Do you think this rifle on the bed still works?
Sir Francis walks over to the bed, puts his drink down on a table, and picks up the rifle to take a look at it.
Was he good at ascertaining the nature of such gunpowder weapons?
Sir Francis had been hunting with his father every summer since he was able to ride a horse, and knew his way around guns very well.
And
so
at this moment, did he looked at the rifle. It seemed ordinary enough, nothing too expensive. It was loaded with a single shot, of course. And it seemed like it had been loaded fairly recently, within the last few hours.
So Francis puts the rifle back down. Well, someone's been here fairly recently, as this gun does appear to have been recently loaded. It is packed. Did you all check out back?
What do you make of that? Do you reckon there are dangerous animals around, Matthew said, or perhaps was he trying to ward off the natives?
Sir Francis laughed. There's always dangerous animals in the woods, and if you ask the right certain people, they will tell you the savages are animals.
You see, the funny thing is, Matthew said, Sir Francis, I have an inkling that the owner of this abode is a gentleman like yourself, if you know what I mean. What do you make of this?
Sir Francis looks at the box that's playing the music to see if he recognizes it. And faintly he remembers seeing something similar on a trip once to his auntie's. She had something similar. He picks up the box to take a look underneath.
There is a small wind at the bottom, like a key, basically, turning that's ever so gently underneath the box.
He smiles and says, "Ah, I knew I'd seen one of these before. My auntie had one. You see, basically, it's almost like a clock. You wind it up on here on the bottom, and then it plays. But was it playing when you came in the house, or did it start after?"
It seemed to me that once we were inside, we could hear its tones, yes.
Well, they usually don't play very long, depending on how far you can wind them. Once again, with what we have of the gun being recently loaded, it appears someone has been here in the last couple of hours or so. And then Sir Francis walks to look out the back window.
It is dark outside. Night has fallen. Sir Francis could see nothing at all.
He turns to his compatriots. It's unusual for someone to be out this late in the country, regardless of where you're at, especially with natives around, in the dark, especially leaving your gun loaded. I never go anywhere without my gun.
Certainly, you know about these things, Matthew said, being a gentleman and all. I mean, if I'd been born in your station, I think I would have undertaken the grand tour of Europe, except instead of hunting. But it takes all sorts to make this wonderful world of ours, west, north to south. And with this, actually, Matthew would like to walk back into the other room.
Matthew stepped out without any problems, entering the front room, the living room area, once again, not discerning any change in the last few minutes or so.
He blew out his small lamp, placed it on the furniture next to the candle, leaving it for a moment. Took another of the figurines that was next to the candles, and then he tried to see if perhaps he could dip it in the concoction, just very little, just the very tip, and see what happened.
The three of his companions left behind in the back room, did they follow Matthew Higgins back into the front room, or did they prefer to remain in the back for now?
Arthur followed Matthew into the front room. He seemed kind of spooked in the back room.
So Francis checked the back door to make sure it was locked before grabbing the rifle and heading back to the main room.
The back door was actually not locked. So Francis could open it quite easily.
So Francis opened the back door slightly, creating a crack.
There was little light in the room behind for Francis now, for Matthew Higgins had taken his lantern with him. So the only thing he saw was a few cobblestones that seemed to create the start of some sort of path, winding away into the darkness towards this massive willow, its overhanging branches casting a large shadow on the ground behind the house.
So Francis remarked, "Well, that's not creepy at all," and proceeded to close the door, lock it.
So Francis could not lock the door. The door had no key. There was a lock, but he could not see any key in the room.
That is strange. So Francis grabs the rifle and heads back to the main room and proceeds to tell everyone, so there's no key to this back door, yet it's unlocked. So someone obviously has been here recently. I've grabbed the rifle on the off chance someone should come back and think we broke in. I don't much pleasure the idea of being shot. And then sets the rifle kind of off to the ways
leaning the rifle against the wall on the side. What was Zechariah doing in the meantime?
Zechariah walked back through the main room, considered for a moment the temptation of the warm fire and the bubbling pot of broth above it, but opted instead to go back outside to the wagon to retrieve his precious large leather traveling trunk, which, despite its size and bulk, he insisted always on handling by himself, and with some difficulty managed to manhandle it into the main room.
While Zechariah was carrying his satchel, he could feel something, like a gaze was upon him, the feeling of being watched. His eyes were darting around the darkness. You could see the shape of the horse to his right, mostly unmoving. Did he see where this weird feeling was coming from?
He did.
Zechariah, with wide eyes, to his left, in the shadows of night, saw a large figure standing, sort of leaning against the side of the house, half hidden around the corner, definitely looking at Zechariah, who was carrying this large satchel. For a moment, it seemed the figure was carrying a large axe at its side, and then it moved to the left, out of view, disappearing behind the corner of the house.
Zechariah swallowed hard. Sir? Sir? He called out after the vanishing figure.
There was no response from the darkness.
Arthur quickly stumbled out to see what the commotion is about and asked, what is going on? Did you see someone?
I did indeed. Someone that I took to be our host. A large gentleman disappeared behind the corner of the wall there.
Well, maybe you should check it out?
I think perhaps that we have others in our company who are more suited to such a task. Let me just put this inside, and I'll narrate to them these troubling events.
Excellent.
While the voices of Zechariah and Arthur, slightly muffled, coming through the wall from the outside, Matthew Higgins and Sir Francis Nesbitt were standing in the front room, looking around. A strange noise came to their ear. It came quite distinctly from the back room, to which the door was still slightly open. From the darkness of that back room, both of them could hear a weird scratching, like claws on wood, like rats or maybe some animal. Skittering.
Matthew Higgins seemed to be absorbed completely by his experimentation. Had he noticed anything happening to the doll?
He looked over his shoulder. The door seemed still as they left it. The door to the back room was still partially open. A little bit of light from this lantern on the ceiling above his head falling into the room. He did notice no movement there.
What had happened to the doll when he dunked a little tip of it into the broth?
Nothing. Except that a little bit of the broth now was sticking, was now stuck to the leg of one of these little stick figures.
So Francis goes and picks the rifle back up. Matthew, quit playing with dolls. Take this. It sounds like we've got some kind of creature in the house. Whether it came in the back door or not, we need to see.
Sir Francis, do you have your own firearm? Would you not rather take this rifle? You are more adept at it than I.
I have my own. And with that, Sir Francis pulls out the pistol he grabbed earlier when checking out the road. And proceeds to go back to the back room.
As Sir Francis entered the back room, a shadow loomed to his left, standing behind the door, and a hand, large, thick, hairy fingers, shot out of the darkness, grabbing for the hand that clutched the pistol. Was Sir Francis fast enough to react?
Seeing the hand come at him, Sir Francis fell backwards and at the same time pulled the trigger.
The shot shot through an explosion in the silence, hitting the back wall, firing very close to the head of this figure that had emerged from the darkness. The figure jumped backwards and swung, not in a dangerous manner, more in a slightly threatening one, a large woodcutter's axe through the room. The light coming from the front room, twinkling along the blade for a moment. And then Sir Francis and Matthew Higgins could hear a deep voice, the voice of a man, a voice saying, "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" And they could both see, now stepping partially into the light, a large white-shouldered man dressed in leather with a thick, bushy black beard and long black hair, a large, nearly potato-like nose and bushy eyebrows covering most of his face. It was a white man, apparently, the axe in his hands looking rather threatening, parts of his clothing a little damp from the rain, and his heavy boots leaving behind muddy footprints on the ground. So Francis, on the floor on his back, pointing the now unloaded gun at this figure, and Matthew Higgins, who still holding this one stick figure in his hand, frozen in the other room, both saw this figure. And of course, Zechariah Throckmorton and Arthur Scott had both heard the shot and could now hear, without understanding what it was saying, this stranger's voice booming out.
Whether it's from the shock or at the whole situation, Sir Francis just starts laughing. By gods, man! Oh, you scared me. Oh, sorry for that. Obviously I've done some damage, and I'll compensate you for that. We are on our way to. Oh, I'm sorry.
Are you some sort of sneak thieves coming to take mine? The man's dark eyes were darting through the room, checking his belongings. Where is my rifle? Did you take it?
Oh, sir, Matthew said. As you can see, I have your rifle. I was simply admiring it. It is very fine craftsmanship. You are a man of taste.
The man turned towards Matthew Higgins, his eyes locking with Matthew's, and he took 2 steps into the doorway, ignoring for now Sir Francis Nesbitt behind him in the room, as his eyes fell first upon the rifle, but then darting over to Matthew's other hand, still clutching the stick figure. His eyes grew wide, and there was even more anger in them now. And he took 2 more steps. His knuckles on his large, hairy hands clutched tightly and protruding white from his skin as he was clutching this large woodcutter's axe with both hands. "What are you doing with that?" his voice said, trembling with anger.
You must forgive my abrupt curiosity, good sir, Matthew said, as he seemed to be handing the man his rifle and his figurine. Have you made these figures yourself? Are you perhaps a curious person of a spiritual nature looking for the meanings behind simple things?
The man's gaze turned suspicious as he took both the rifle and the stick figure, slinging the rifle over his shoulder and putting the stick figure away on the side. And now both Matthew and Sir Francis could see that this man had also had a leather bag tied to the side of his belt on the back. that was also slightly damp and dripping a little bit of water. How many of you are there? Where do you come from? He said.
Picking himself up, Sir Francis looked and said, "I'm sorry, sir. We came upon your house not too long ago. We were on our way to Hollow Lake, but the bridge was out. And we saw the side road, and we took the side road thinking it would loop around. And obviously it got dark. We saw the light from the cabin. We pulled ourselves in. We knocked. No one answered.
The man abruptly cutting in. You got past the tree. You made your way all the way here. Why?
The tree was in our way, and we had our cart and our horse, and so we moved the tree to try to make it to Hollow Lake.
The man shook his head. This is not the path to Hollow Lake. You would have to cross the river to get to the village. It is about 5 or 6 miles from here.
So there's no way to Hollow Lake from this side road.
There is only one bridge crossing the river.
And what do you do when the bridge is out?
I wait for the river to go down, and then people from the village repair it. It is the only path to the village from the outside world, as you probably know, since you took the road yourselves. As this conversation was happening, Zechariah and Arthur, who was standing right outside the front door, could very distinctly hear all the words.
Arthur fidgeted a bit with his coat and took out this small knife that didn't really look threatening at all, but it gave him some safety, and he stood next to the door, awaiting, seeing if someone came out, and just looking very scared.
Zechariah, still struggling with the weight of his traveling trunk, brought it inside, surveying the scene.
Zechariah immediately recognized the silhouette of this large, white-shoulders, bearded man as the man that he had seen only a minute or two ago outside, lurking in the darkness.
As he sized up the situation, his life's work rushed into the forefront of his brain. He places the trunk down on the floor, and with an insincere smile, he crossed the floor, shook the man, offered his hand to the bearded man.
The man looked down upon his hand and proceeded not to shake it. However, he did give a hesitant nod, calming down a little bit, apparently, to the 3 men that were now sharing the room with him. So there's how many of you then? Is there more lurking about?
Arthur Scott quickly followed after. Said, yes, I am the last of us. I must admit I was quite scared.
These are scary times. You are right to be scared. The woods can be dangerous, especially for those who are strangers here. The name's Hartman, Benjamin Hartman.
A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Master Hartman. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Zechariah Throckmorton, and I am at your service, and, if I may be so bold, in your debt. And he bowed low, removing his hand.
The man said, his eyes scanning the other 3 men in the room.
Well, sir, not to put too fine a point on it, your excellent and commodious house is, I think, perhaps the only shelter that we may look forward to on such a cold and inhospitable night in the wilds. And I'm sure that for some suitable payment, in kind or in specie, we may perhaps avail ourselves of your roof this evening.
You wish to stay, all of you, for the night until morning?
I don't venture to speak for all of my companions, but I would certainly welcome a roof over my head and a warm fire.
As would I. As would I.
Yes, that certainly sounds better than going the whole night out there.
The man was quiet for a bit, his jaw working as if he was trying to get a piece of meat stuck between his teeth out with his tongue. Then he forced a small grin that did not seem particularly sincere on his face, a few teeth showing surprisingly white under this bushy black beard. He nodded. Very well then. We had some misunderstandings. I took you to be thieves I was shot at. But the woods are dark, deep, and cold. No Christian man can refuse well-mannered guests in these times. And who knows? When you owe me, this might prove beneficially to me in the long run. And he nodded to each of the men in turn, a slight bow of the head.
That is most appreciated. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very well. Make yourselves comfortable. I am preparing dinner. There is enough for the 5 of us. And he pointed with his head towards the cauldron. Let me just get out of this. And he sort of ran a finger along his slightly damp leather jacket or cloak he was wearing.
Certainly, my good man.
He hesitated and walked over to the table and put one of the stick figures back, and then stopped there because he had apparently noticed that there was still one missing. He turned. Did anyone take one of the toys? His gaze scanning.
A thousand pardons, my good man. And Matthew handed him the other figurine immediately.
The man grabbed it with a surprisingly aggressive, quick motion, his fingers briefly touching yours, a fingernail maybe even digging into your skin a little bit as he grabbed the figurine, and then relaxing a bit, put it back onto the table, the very same spot that you had taken it from. Do not touch anything. You can stay here, but I like my things the way they are, he said. Is that understood?
Of course, you have a very interesting decoration, sir.
Yes, you are clearly a man of taste. I hope you will forgive my intrusive question, but I am a curious man by nature. Do you always keep that candle lit?
Questions later. Now, food. And the man turned, leaving the 4 companions behind, and disappeared in the back room, closing the door behind him.
Oh, a direct and yes, clearly a man of directness. Not a bad thing to have in this weather, wouldn't you say? Matthew said to his companions.
A curious man, yes, but I am grateful we can stay here.
Sir Francis, pulling up a chair, says, but Matthew, I'd stop touching his stuff.
No matter, I can very well examine something without touching it. And I shall be more discreet.
Sir Francis, looks around and says, "Well, if our host is going to provide dinner, I think it's only fair that I provide liquid refreshment." And he goes to retrieve the bottle that he had in his belongings that Arthur had pulled out before to sit on the table.
Stepping out, Sir Francis noticed that the temperature had fallen further in the last quarter of an hour or so. Even though it had only been maybe half an hour since the sun had set, maybe a little more. But he made it his way towards the horse, standing there slightly shivering and taking out the well-known little bottle or flask that he had used so many times in the last couple of months, taking it with him and returning to the light of the hut.
Sir Francis stops at the light and walks back to the cart to pull out a blanket to put over the shivering horse.
The horse seemed grateful.
Pats the horse on the head and says, "It's going to be a long night and it's getting cold. Stay warm."
The
and
horse
heads back in.
Nudged you a little and then let you leave. Returning back, you could hear heavy footsteps from the back room. The door opened, and the man, Benjamin Hartman, your host, entered, carrying in one hand this leather satchel that you had seen before on his side, and the other a bundle of firewood that he must have gotten somewhere from the outside. Without saying a word to any of you, he made his way across the room and started piling firewood onto the fireplace. A few bits here and there, and putting the satchel on the side of the small table that was standing in the kitchen, then reaching up behind him and taking one of the skinned rabbits that you had seen before down from the top. He reached to the side and pulled out a very nasty looking hunting knife from the side, the shelf in the kitchen, and started slowly chopping up the rabbit with quick, methodical motions. His back to you, not speaking. It seemed that quiet was ruling the hut at this moment, despite the presence of 5 men in the same room.
Sir Francis not looking all the quiet. "Who'd like a drink?"
The man did not turn, did not speak, continued to chop meat.
That sounds lovely. It'll be sure to warm us up.
There's a flask passed from one man to the other. Warmth did indeed settle in your stomachs, made you feel a little better.
Splendid idea. I shall also partake.
It was a good spirit, strong as it has to be, as it had to be in this cold night. The man, in the meantime, Master Hartman, moved over the cauldron, adding several of thinly sliced rabbit meat to the broth, grabbing the satchel with one hand, putting the other underneath into it, and seemingly adding some wild onions and a few other forest herbs, apparently, to the broth. Then taking a large wooden spoon and slowly starting to stir it. Without turning again, he spoke. "This will take a while. Make yourself comfortable. I'd say about an hour or so until it's done." The room was slowly getting a bit warmer with the extra wood that had been added to the fire.
Sir, do you have a place where we can sleep tonight? I would put my belongings there.
I only have one bed, and I'm not about to offer it to you. It only goes so far. The man turned briefly. You caught a glimmer of one eye and the side of his beard. You can sleep in this room as long as you don't touch anything. Floor's gonna be cold, but there's a fireplace in here. It'll keep you warm. There's plenty of firewood out the back if you need to add any.
Of course, thank you. Then Arthur went out and recovered some of his belongings to take into
It
the
was
hut.
now black outside. Arthur opened the door, stared out through darkness without seeing anything, apparently. Not even the horse was standing a few yards to his left. However, while this was happening, Zechariah and Matthew, who were watching their host cook, they noticed something strange. There was a slight tightening of the shoulders of this massive man. Were they able to read his posture?
Zechariah narrowed his eyes.
Matthew seemed to notice something.
They both saw the host hesitating as the door opened in his movement, and ever so slightly turned his head towards it, gazing out over Arthur's shoulders into the darkness, tensing a bit and then turning away again, continuing to stir the broth.
Zechariah, warm, spirit-filled, put it down to being irritated, the man being irritated at his door being opened on such a cold night when he just built the fire up, and sat back in his chair and held his feet closer to the fire.
Did Arthur go outside?
Realizing that he didn't see anything at all, Arthur quickly closed the door again and just took off his coat and tried to make something like a bed out of it. At least something he could sleep on.
The floor was dirt floor in this room. It was cold, but there was at least a little bit of a rug. Arthur had probably slept on worse situations before. While the broth was being cooked, a little bit of a flask was being passed around a little bit. The man remained at the fireplace, Hartman just stirring. Simple motions. Ever so slightly, sometimes the four travelers, the strangers, could see his head turning, gazing to the room, to the door to the back, and to the door to the front, as if he had been waiting or listening out for something. Some of the strangers, of the four travelers, could, because of this quiet, and despite the door to the back being closed, hear two things distinctly: the ticking of the clock, and again this weird scratching sound. The man seemed to not hear it or ignore it, at least.
My good man, do you have trouble with pests around these parts? Rodents, perhaps?
Pests? The man spoke without turning. What do you mean?
Well, that scratching, it seemed to me it would be mice, perhaps.
The man's whole form tensed for a moment, but still he did not turn. Scratching? Don't be ridiculous. I don't hear any scratching. You're a city boy, aren't you? He said, after a brief pause. Not used to the sounds of the forest. There's no scratching here. Your mind imagines things.
You're most likely right. It must be perhaps it's the rustling of the brush, and I mistake it for sounds that I'm more familiar with, like mice. They are quite common in London back in the the old country.
Yes, that must be what it is, the man said, slightly relaxing again and continuing to stir the broth.
Matthew waited a few more moments, not to seem too pushy, but after another swig of the bottle and a few minutes passing, he said, "Speaking of undesirables, do you have problems with the natives in these parts?"
Natives? Indians, you mean? No, there are some around, but only a small group. They live beyond the river on a hill. They don't bother me.
See, my friend, my companion, Zechariah, he thought he saw someone on the way here.
There's no one out here. The man turned briefly, looking at Zechariah, locking eyes with him. And Zechariah saw something in his eyes. But there was shadow lying across the man's face. Flickering shadow. Did he manage to read the man's expression?
He did.
There was definitely a nervousness and anger, but also fear. Just for a brief moment, then the man blinked and turned back again towards the cauldron.
Zechariah, anxious not to be turfed out of this, what would pass for a comfortable billet in these circumstances, turned to Higgins. "Oh, well, let's not overplay it, sir. Eyes play tricks and all that, don't they? I'm sure there's nothing untoward here."
I've seen enough smoke and mirrors and opium dens to know that what you say is true, my friend.
Zechariah sidles a glance at his host in an attempt to gauge his reaction.
Zechariah saw a slight leaving of tension from the large back muscles and shoulders of his host, who nonetheless did not turn around. It seemed nearly as if he was deliberately avoiding to turn towards his guests.
Zechariah's shoulders sank as the tension drained away from him as the uncomfortable moment passed. And he was content that he had rescued his night indoors and by the fire.
A bit of time passed. The man stirring the fireplace, stirring the cauldron and adding 2 or 3 logs to the fireplace. And the travelers could feel, despite that the night was getting colder. There was a bit of a chill slowly pushing its way through the wooden walls, maybe through the window or the door, or maybe rising up from the packed wooden dirt floor of this room. And again, they swore that they could hear this scratching sound coming from the back of the house. The man, again, either did not hear it or ignored it.
Matthew shuddered, his memory going back to the ship that had brought him to this land, and how it was infested with rats. Day and night he would hear them, especially at night.
Eventually the man turned and he took this large ladle-like spoon out of the broth and had a small taste, blew on it. And I think this is done. He walked over to the kitchen area and removed several wooden bowls from a small cupboard on the side and started dishing out hefty portions of this rabbit broth and holding out the broth, a wooden container to each of his guests.
Matthew seemed almost eager. He was the first one to take the bowl from the man. And he smelled it again, trying to pinpoint that spice or herb that he had smelled earlier.
Could he still smell it?
He was able to detect something, yes.
Matthew Higgins could smell the meat, maybe not perfectly cooked yet, of the rabbit, but good enough. But he could also still detect a slightly different odor, a little different from the one he had detected previously, maybe through the cooking process or some such. But it was definitely still there, some unfamiliar herb, or maybe multiple, or vegetable maybe, or some such.
Matthew took...
take their broth?
Zechariah is mildly disappointed not to have got there first. But he eagerly takes the bowl. He took the bowl that was proffered, and presumably a spoon or some such.
Yes.
And attributing whatever peculiar odor he may have noted to this newfangled colonial cooking, wolfed it down.
Matthew ached to ask about the spice, but thought to himself, if I ask before I taste it, then he might take offense. So he took a few spoonfuls and gobbled it up. It was warm and comforting. First thing of this nature in the whole evening.
It seemed maybe not quite done, but other than that, warm and filling, not too bad. The taste was not at all like the smell. In fact, it tasted like a fairly fresh meat broth, like the travelers had had many times in their lives.
You sure know how to cook a good English broth, my man. I commend you.
The host, Hartman, was leaning against the wall now, holding a small plate in his hand, a bowl in his hand, and just blowing on it occasionally, and watching his guests. Did Sir Nesbitt and did Sir Nesbitt and Arthur Scott partake in the offered dinner?
Sir Nesbitt takes the bowl offered him, but he's not much for extremely hot soup, so he's blowing on it till he gets cool enough before he partakes of it.
Arthur looked at the soup, smelled it, and decided that even though he didn't recognize the smell, he was hungry enough to just eat it, and yeah, also started eating it.
Hartman gave you a nod and said, "Enjoy. I'll go get some more firewood." Okay. Taking the bowl with him, he walked across the room and disappeared into the back room.
The man seems to not be fond of hot stew, just like you, Sir Francis.
I just don't want to burn my tongue. If I burn my tongue, I can't taste my spirits.
Is that right? Do you take them for the taste?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Is that right? Do you drink them for the taste? I never took you for a connoisseur.
Sir Francis smiles. Oh, I used to be a connoisseur. Today's luck finds me headed to Hollow Lake.
Well, here's to new beginnings, and Matthew proceeds to drink the rest of the liquid and eat the meat.
The meat was a little stringy. This rabbit or whatever it was had certainly seen better days, but it was filling. And all the men had had worse food than that in their lives, for certain. After 10 minutes or so, Hartman returned, put his empty bowl back into the kitchen, and took the 4 bowls from his guests, all the spoons, and just shoving them aside. Was it good? He asked. I'm not much of a cook, but I get
Oh,
by.
don't sell yourself short, my man. I surely enjoyed it. There's some kind of herb or spice that you must have added to the broth before I smelled it. First moment we walked in here. I don't think it's found in England.
I'm not sure. I'm not much of a herbalist myself. I mix and match. There are different herbs out here, types of onions and roots and such. I've tried them all, don't worry. The man forced a small grin again. They're not poisonous or anything.
No matter. When I came to the New World, they told me about the local food, but I thought, the worst that can happen is an evening spent in the water closet. Haha, that's all. But I'm sure that won't happen with your cooking.
Well, I certainly hope not. Well then, evening's still young, but I'd understand if you wanted to go to bed. You must be tired from the journey. The man nodded to each of you in turn. Feel free to make yourself comfortable, he said, pointing at the corners of the room that you were in. Don't let me stop you. I'm used to going to bed late. I hope me being up won't bother you too much.
Not a problem, my man. But would you like a drink of what Sir Francis brought?
The man hesitated and then nodded. Certainly, I could use a drink.
Sir Francis takes the flask out of his jacket again and offers it to the man.
Hartman takes the flask a little hesitantly, uncorks it, and takes a few pretty large. Took a few pretty large gulps. This is good. He handed the flask back over, and you could all see that his hands were shaking slightly as he did so. Then he wiped his hands off the sides of his cloak. This is very good. Thank you. An even exchange for my meager cooking, I'd say.
Sir Francis here is a liker of fine things. So are you, I gather, judging from the rather impressive clock and the French figurine.
They were gifts. I honestly don't really know much what to do with them. Clock's all good and fine, but living in the woods, one doesn't have that much use for the passing of minutes. Music is... There was a shadow over the man's eyes, of like a painful memory passing by. And he said, music is just, well, nothing important here, leader.
Zechariah's ears pricked up as he scented an advantage. I wonder then, good sir, perhaps you might be persuaded to exchange them for something that would be of more use to your rustic existence.
Exchange?
Yes.
Sounded a little confused. What do you mean?
One moment, sir. Zechariah walked across to his travelling trunk, cast an eye about him, opened the lid without taking care not to reveal the contents to anybody else in the room, and turned around carrying a sharkskin leather bag from which came the clink of bottles. What I have here, Master Hartman, is something that no woodsman should be without. For it is proof against the ague, it is proof against the dropsy, it is proof against the canker. Whatever may ail a man, this will cure.
I suffer no such ailment. The man's eyes were a little confused still, and as he looked at the other three men in the room, is this your profession then? You sell medicine? All of you?
No, I am rather a seeker of a cure of a spiritual nature I am looking for. Well, I won't bother you with the long tale. But I have stopped at many an altar in search of solace.
Solace? It's not a word I'm very familiar with.
I mean, calm, quiet.
Yes, I understand. Yes. The man shook his head, ran his thick, hairy fingers through his hair and beard. His gaze falling back onto Zechariah hesitantly. We can talk about any medicine in the morning. I'll think about it.
As you will, but perhaps take a bottle on trial. Take a sip this evening, guaranteed a restful night's sleep.
The man, one of his hands slightly reaching out as if on its own accord towards you, stopped and then retrieved his hand back and shook his head. No, not tonight. I think I'll handle it. You must be tired, all of you, he said, cutting off Zechariah's words fairly rudely. You're probably looking for a good night's sleep. I hope you sleep deeply and quietly. Don't touch anything. And as I said before, the woods are weird sometimes. Sometimes you hear weird noises. It's better to just ignore them and sleep. Everything looks much better in the morning when the sun rises, especially in a night like this, All Hallows Eve. And there's a slight tremble that goes through his figure. He clears his throat a couple times. Forgive me. As I said, you must be tired. And he pointed around the room once more. Lie down wherever you think is best. Don't get too close to the fire. And he moved over to a corner and sat on a chair there next to the table, one of his hands reaching out and grabbing one of these little stick figurines as he absent-mindedly, gazing out the window into the darkness, started playing with it a bit and maybe dozing a little. The guests were not quite sure, but it seemed a dismissal in a way, the way he was sitting and the way he spoke his words to you.
Arthur quickly went to his spot where he laid out his coat and cozied into it. He tried to stay awake though, at least as long as his as the host was awake. He didn't want to go to sleep before anyone else.
Did Arthur manage to stay awake?
Yes, Arthur managed to stay awake.
While Arthur was lying there, he felt a weird tingling sensation, like cold creeping into his body, but not quite cold. He felt tipsy in a way, even though he had not drunk much. But despite all this, despite his eyelids getting heavy, he managed to stay awake for now. What were the rest of our travelers doing at that moment?
Matthew Higgins was staring into the fire, thinking of things that were troubling him. He thought of the man and how he had seen the look in his eyes before, the look of somebody without peace. He had seen it in the opium dens. He had seen it in the churches. He had seen it in the occultism groups that he went to before he left, every single one of them, one after the other. For a moment, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small metal chain. Out of sight of the others, he examined what was hanging from it. There was a cross, and a crescent moon, and a Star of David, and some kind of oriental symbol. He touched each of them for a moment, then shook his head and put them back in. And he wrapped himself in his coat and tried to get some sleep.
And despite the closeness to the fire, Matthew Higgins felt in a weird way as if he could not really get warm. This house was cold. The floor, packed dirt, was cold, and the cold of the floor itself seemed to be slowly seeping into his bones. He moved a little closer to the fireplace, and despite the cold, he slowly felt sleep take him. What was Sir Francis Nesbitt doing at the time?
Sir Francis, after dinner and sharing a drink, went about first reloading his pistol from his belt. And after he had taken care to do so and put it away, started to feel a little tired, so he went and found a spot close to the fire that he could, and using his jacket as a pillow, laid down for sleep.
So Francis felt very tired. He also felt cold, and the broth did not seem to be really agreeing with him much. His stomach was quietly rumbling, and there was a little bit of pain there. But hopefully that too would have been passed in the morning, as Sir Francis did his best, his pistol close by, to find rest, and so he did. Master Zachariah Throckmorton, what was he doing at the time? Well, two at least of his companions had fallen asleep.
His sales pitch having been rebuffed, but the door not having closed altogether, he lay as close as he dared to the embers of the fire, and for a few moments contemplated with his characteristic avarice the profit he would make selling such fine French workmanship in the nearest available town. But try as he might, he could not quite shake the image of a pale woman standing amid the trees, and every time a bough outside creaked or the house settled, he flicked his eyes open with a jerk and huddled up against the fire.
Zachariah Throckmorton felt his nerves slowly getting out of hand. There was just something about the whole place. The face, this pale figure looking at him, the eye staring at him from the brush. Maybe a mortal, maybe some apparition or some sort. He could not help but think back on the nervous way that the eyes of their host, Benjamin Hartman, had flickered over to the door when it was opened. And he could not help but let his eyes linger on his host, who was staring out the window with a very strong focus, apparently, clutching one of these stick figures in one hand with a nearly painful grip, his axe and his rifle close by, but not quite in reach. And Zechariah felt weird, unsettled. Sleep would not come, and there was again and again this weird scratching sound coming from the other room, just on the edge of hearing, as if an animal was trying to claw its way in or out of the building. And while Zechariah was listening, he became aware that Arthur Scott was awake and also listening to this sound. It was getting more and more frequent, although not louder necessarily. And they both became aware of their host listening as well. His head still turned away to the window, but every time the scratching sounded, his posture shifted ever so slightly, and a small tremble ran across his shoulders. The ticking of the clock, also from that back room, seemed to be the only thing breaking the silence, except for a bit of creaking trees outside and the whispering of the willow branches touching each other in the wind.
Zechariah struggled to contain the tension. And finally, not able to any longer, he sat up and shouted at the back door, in the love of God, will you just leave us alone? And then
burst woke the other two that had just fallen asleep maybe half an hour ago. They both, Matthew Higgins and Sir Francis Nesbitt, struggling in the grip of sleep, struggling to be awakened. Their host, Benjamin Harton, had sat up. What? What did you say? He asked.
Can't you hear it, man? That damned scrabbling at the door, it's been going on all night. And we've all been pretending to ignore it, but...
What? No, there's no... You shut your mouth! The man stood up quite abruptly. I can't hear anything. There's nothing there. You must have had too much to drink, man. Go back to sleep.
Zechariah mutely appealed to his companions, hoping that the
Good God,
scratching could be
Zechariah,
heard.
you gave us quite a scare, but I have to agree with my compatriot, good man. I mean, there is perhaps you've just gotten used to it. I mean, living here for so long, you hear squirrels chewing at the wooden walls. You'll just learn to forget it, not hear it anymore. But
squirrels or some such, or rats or something. That's all there is. The man looked around the room, not looking towards the door at the back by any means, though.
I'm not disputing it, good man. I'm not disputing it. But you must forgive my compatriot. He's had a rough night. He did see something earlier, didn't you, Zechariah?
What do you mean? The man, his gaze now intent upon Zechariah.
A woman.
You could see all the color draining out of the man's face at the mention of this mere word. What?
I can deny it no longer. Yes, indeed. A figure in the woods as the light was fading. A pale-faced, haunted woman. Dark hair. And the eyes. Oh, God, the eyes.
No, the man took a step backwards, with both his hands reaching out and clutching one of the little stick figures each, holding it to his chest, as if he was trying to protect them from something, or himself with them. No, that's you're lying. There's no women out here. There's only a few redskins on the other side of the river and the villagers, and none of their women would enter Winter Wood. Not at night, by any means.
This Matthew Higgins piped up. The figures, man, the figures. They're not toys. You can't fool me. I've seen these things before. These are occult. You're trying to ward yourself from something, aren't you?
What? What are you talking about? They belong to my daughter. They're toys. They're just keepsakes.
So Frederick looks, your daughter? Where is your daughter? We haven't seen anyone but you.
No, she died 2 years back. A fever took her. She was a young girl. These belong to her. I made them for her.
You'll forgive me prying, my good man, but at this time of night and the way we've been woken up, my manners are out the window anyway. You mentioned a daughter. What of your wife?
My wife, she left. She didn't. She didn't want to be here anymore. The memories, they were too painful. You could now all see the man shaking slightly and still pale-faced. He dropped one of the stick figures back onto the table, but still clutched the other one. I buried my daughter myself out the back. My wife, she didn't want any of this. Of it. She left.
If there are no dangerous animals, no dangerous Indians,
Well,
why do you stay up all night looking at the doors? You seem to be afraid. You're more afraid than us, and you've lived here years, you said.
It's a dark forest. You never know on an evening like this. You've heard the stories, surely. And with 4 strangers arriving, he gestured wildly at all 4 of you. One of them firing a gun at me. I'm sure you understand. Hartman was trying to remain calm, but there was a contrast between the apparent calm of his words and the extreme, nearly aggression that he was partially crushing the stick figure in his fist, knuckles white.
Hartman, you're breaking the toy.
Yes, he released it a bit, holding it loosely in his hand now. You should all go back to sleep, he suggested. Everything looks better in the morning when the sun is up. Just ignore any noise you might hear. While he was talking, and in the quiet that followed his words, you could very distinctly hear the scratching once more, coming somewhere from the back room.
There's clearly something bothering you, Hartman. It's not just my friend here, Zechariah. You said earlier that the debt we owed you might come in handy to you. Do you need help? I've been...
No. There is no help needed. He shook his head. You just sleep. You leave in the morning. We'll talk about a debt, a potential debt in a couple of days or so. I'll visit you in Hollow Lake, in the village, need be, once you made your way there.
As if in a trance, Zechariah stood and, without meeting anyone's eye, walked towards the back room door.
What are you doing? What is he doing? The host stood up once more, but not
Zechariah.
Towards Zechariah.
I don't like rats. You better keep that door closed.
Zechariah turned around, his eyes hollow, haunted, terrified. Masters, if you believe there are rats out there, you are sorely mistaken, and I will not spend the night under this roof with whatever it is scratching out there. I mean, to confront it, or for it to flee.
You go out in the darkness then if you don't want to stay in my house. The man pointed at the front door with a shaky finger. You can freeze to death out there, if you prefer that.
Zechariah's hand reached for the latch of the back room door.
No! What are you doing? The man, he reached his hand towards Zechariah, but he did make no movement towards him, as if his feet were glued to the floor.
Zechariah opens the door.
The room beyond, swallowed by darkness. Few flickering sparks of light thrown by the fire, which is, however, heavily obscured by Zechariah's, which was heavily obscured by Zechariah's shadow now stretching into the room and being swallowed by the darkness. Zechariah could not see any movement except for the clock was swinging a little. But
Master
very
Higgins
distinctly
rose
he
to his
could
feet.
hear the scratching once more. The scratching came from somewhere in the darkness in the room. It still seemed a little faint, in a way that Zechariah briefly wondered how he could hear it in the other room at all through the door. It definitely did not come from any of the outer walls. It seemed to be coming from the floor.
Zechariah stopped halfway across the room as this realization struck him.
The three other travelers could see Zechariah stepping into the room and then stopping. A shadowy figure now, slightly silhouetted by the firelight. The host had fallen silent, one hand still stretched out towards Zechariah, his face completely white, unmoving. Just a slight tremble in his fingers.
Having risen to his feet, Matthew Higgins lit his little oil lamp with the flame of the candle again, and with his other hand, he reached into his coat and pulled out something that he had not showed you before, a small, ceremonial-looking knife.
The host's eyes were glued to Zechariah's back, unmoving. Hartman's fingers were still slightly trembling, his lips struggling to form words, but you could only see movement, no sound escaping.
Arthur quickly moved up from his makeshift bed and moved in the opposite corner of the back door. He was very visibly scared and wanted to be as far away from that door as possible.
What about Sir Francis?
Sir Francis, seeing this, gets up. For God's sakes, man, it's night time. It's sleeping time. Yes, the scratching. It's expected out in the woods. Close the door. Zechariah, your imagination is making this more than it is.
Zechariah's gaze fixed on the floor, on the rug, on the floorboards. The floorboards. The floorboards. He gets down on his knees, put his ear to the ground.
Very distinctly, Zechariah could hear scratching, like nails on wood, but a few inches away from his head.
She's here. She's here. She's here, damn you all. She's here. And
who's here?
With desperate scrabbling motion, Zechariah began clawing at the floorboards.
His fingers clawing into the wood, ripping away the sort of a piece of fur that was lying there as a rug. He found something, a latch, halfway concealed in the wooden floorboard.
panicking, his fingers scrabbled at it, unable quite to make the lock function in his panic.
What did he say? Benjamin Hartman seemed to have found his voice again. I don't know. Stop him.
Stop.
Words mangled.
Stop him from what, man? Freaking out?
We need. Lips opening, tongue darting out.
What is under the trapdoor, man? What is it that you're trying to protect us from?
Nothing. There's nothing there. You need to go back to sleep. We need the sun. Everything will be better. Hartman took 2 steps backwards, pressing himself against the wall. One of his fingers hesitantly reaching out towards the axe and gripping it to him now. Stop him.
Sir Francis.
Zachariah.
Sir Francis gets up, crosses the floor into the room, grabs Zachariah by his shoulder. Dear gods, man, you're freaking out our host. What is wrong?
Zachariah resisted the nobleman's efforts as best he could in his state. Still, his trembling hands, still scrabbling to make the latch on the trapdoor work.
Could he
He's here! She's here! She's here!
Could Zachariah open the latch?
Ooh, let's have a look. He could not.
Could not. His hands bleeding, splinters stuck in his fingers. He's pushed back by Sir Francis Nesbitt, pulled up onto his feet. Looking on his fingers, he realized that he had hurt himself quite badly. Blood was seeping down into his hands. Not much, but painful enough.
Heedless of the wounds, Zachariah lunged for the trapdoor once more.
Was Sir Francis trying to stop him?
Sir Francis had pulled him up to stop him, but when Zachariah lunged back to the door, it's not like Sir Francis was holding him back.
Excellent. In that case, Zachariah this time grabs a hold of the trapdoor, lifts it open, and flies open and reveals a slim, moist tunnel and a ladder leading down. And down there, the shadow of a door? You're not sure. There was too little light. You were not sure. Too little light in the room.
Zechariah reached into his deep bottle green jacket pocket and drew out a nasty double-bladed shiv and descended the stairwell. She's here. She's here. I'm telling you, she's here.
Benjamin Hartman, hearing this but not seeing what was happening in the other room, called out, "What are you doing? What is going on?" No reply seemed to be coming. Just the footsteps of Zechariah Throckmorton on the ladder, who had now reached this heavy door that he could more feel than see, with what seemed to be a heavy iron chain wrapped around it, a lock, but also a key.
That
It was
scratching.
It was cold down there, and he could see that parts of the moisture of the mud in this hole had frozen.
Zechariah was deaf to anything but the sound of that hideous, animalistic scratching. Convinced now in his own mind that some devilry was concealed, he made an effort to pick up the key and insert it in the lock, heedless of his surroundings.
Sir Francis Nesbitt was standing up in the room, looking down the ladder, seeing what Zechariah was doing. Arthur Scott still huddled in a corner in the front room. Where was Matthew Higgins at this moment? And what was he doing?
Matthew had approached, and he was staring down as well, holding his small light. He reached into his, pulled out the chain and wrapped around his left hand the chain with the crucifix, the Star of David, the Oriental symbol, and the crescent moon. He did the sign of the cross, and then he did other signs. He started muttering to himself, first in English, then in French, and then in some other language, something clicky from the Dark Continent. And then he said, "Well, I would take one of the wooden toys, but I don't think our host would like that. Sir Francis, you good with guns? Shall we go see that our salesman friend does not meet a sticky end?" And he started to go down the ladder.
As Arthur saw his companions go down the ladder, he quickly went over to the room and joined them. He didn't want to be left alone.
While Arthur was moving across the room, finally, Benjamin Hartman seemed to have found his will to move. And he moved fast, like a tiger, across the room, 2 large jumps and leaps. One of his hands clutching the axe, the other grabbing Arthur Scott by the shoulder. His fingers digging deep into his muscle, holding him back. His whisper was hoarse, and there was something bestial, animalistic, glancing out of his eyes, like a beast hidden under the skin of the man. His voice was deep and trembling. No, you can't go down there. They can't. His fingers digging even deeper into Arthur's shoulder.
Under the pain in his shoulder, he quickly tried to take a few steps back, and
could Arthur push Benjamin away?
He could not.
Arthur tried to get away, but this man was large, and he shook him heavily. Arthur was shaken around, and Benjamin pressed him against the wall. Whatever weapon Arthur might have been clutching, just falling onto the ground and being pushed away by Benjamin's foot. Stinking breath shot into Arthur's face as Benjamin leaped in and they can't, and then pushed him across the room as Arthur stumbled over a chair and boom, fell onto the ground, hitting the dirt. Benjamin Hartman took 2 steps into the door, his axe in both hands, tensing, but not quite ready to cross the threshold into the back room, frozen in that position. Matthew Higgins and Sir Francis Nesbitt could both see that from their position. Zechariah, who was down in the hole, of course, could not.
Matthew, his body halfway down the hole, half from the waist up, still above the trapdoor, said, Sir Francis, I think whatever is down there is holding our host back. Too trusting. Perhaps you should get down here with us and...
No!
I shudder to say it, but perhaps close the trapdoor behind us.
Get out of there! You can't let her out! The host's voice booming through the darkness, his eyes open wide. Benjamin Hartman taking one hesitant step, holding the axe in front of him, threatening.
Seeing this, Sir Francis grips his pistol and brings it to bear. Sir, drop your axe and stand down.
You need to get out, the axe. Cut and finger 8 into the air. Get out of there! Get him out!
Sir Francis looks at Benjamin and says once more, Sir, I beg you, drop the axe.
What was Zechariah doing as this was happening? He could hear all this shouting going on distinctly, not far above his head, really. The ladder was not going down very deep.
I think he's muted.
Oh, he was muted, yes, sorry. So what was Zechariah doing at this moment with all the shouting going on above his head?
It's like it's all happening underwater and far away. And Zechariah clenched the blade of the shiv between his teeth. And as he reached to make the key fit the lock, he found himself humming music box, almost contentedly grasped the cold iron key and turned it.
The chain.
As he was doing this, Matthew Higgins was walking down.
Blocking the door. What was Matthew Higgins' reaction to that?
He quickly came down the ladder and actually attempted to close the trapdoor behind him.
Did he manage to close the trapdoor? His fingers fumbling upwards in the semi-darkness.
He did.
The trapdoor closed. And as the trapdoor closed, Benjamin Hartman's eyes grew even wider, and the flame of rage pushed back any fear that he might have felt. And with a shout, across the room, axe held high above his head, preparing to bring it down against the only figure standing in his way, Sir Francis Nesbitt.
Sir Francis shoots.
A shot rang out. Sir Francis hit.
Sir Francis' aim is true as he brings his pistol to bear.
The shot struck Benjamin Hartman in the chest. The man stopped, stumbling backwards. Large a man as he is, this was a dangerous shot. His lifeblood was pouring forth, his cloak drenched in scarlet now. Still holding the axe in one hand, he dropped down onto one knee. Reaching out one hand, his empty hand. No, stop them. I beg of you. And he falls, alive, but heavily injured. Lying on the side of the floor, one hand, but with a very weak grip, still clutched the axe. Blood pouring forth onto the floorboards. In fact, a little bit of blood even going through the wood. And a few drops fell down onto Matthew Higgins and Zechariah Throckmorton as the door was opened. But was Matthew Higgins holding his lantern in his hand at this moment?
Yes, he had it in his left, the one with the religious symbols.
In that case, the light of the lamp shone through the door as it opened, into a small, earthy chamber covered in ice. The walls were frozen, not solid, in patches, where the moisture had dripped down from above in the mud and frozen. And there in the light, the sole occupant of the chamber. Bones. A skeleton. Lying in the mud, shimmering, grayish-white, with a few patches of skin and a few patches of cloth still attached. Strands of black hair obscuring most of the face, whose skin had partially pulled back. Still quite distinctly the skeleton of a woman.
Zechariah stepped through, his body barely registering the drop in temperature. He knelt by the bones.
There is a moment
Matthew Higgins followed.
as Zechariah knelt by the bones. He had seen this woman once before, in a way. The cold, it did not touch Zechariah. He could barely feel it. However, Matthew Higgins, standing behind him, could see his breath in the air, and he could feel the surrounding air nearly pressing in on him from both sides, like two cold hands clutching his flesh. His hands and the light holding in them starting to shake wildly. But he was still in control of his flesh for now. While this was happening down below, what were Sir Francis Nesbitt and Arthur Scott doing?
Sir Francis, after shooting Benjamin, steps over him into the other room. Arthur, are you okay?
Arthur got up again, definitely hurt, but not too much, and said, I think I'll be fine. I don't know what got into him, but whatever's down there can't be good. And then he tried to find his knife again. That he
Could find it easily in a corner of the room. Well, this room is lit well enough, with the fireplace still blazing high. However, both Francis Nesbitt and Arthur Scott noticed that the temperature was dropping rapidly inside, despite the fireplace. They could both see their breath now, and their limbs were starting to shake. It was getting painful to breathe.
Sir Francis looks at Arthur and says, I'm going to be quite honest. This is terribly disturbing, and I think we should grab our compatriots, hook the wagon back up to the damn horse, and take our chances in the dark.
No, you cannot. As they turned, they saw a bloody, heavily injured man crawling out of the room, still clutching the axe in one hand, his beard and his hair now filled with his own blood. As Benjamin Hartman makes his way, at least partially, out of the room, his legs apparently no longer functioning properly. Blood poured out of his mouth onto the ground. His eyes wide, reddish. You cannot. She's coming for all of us.
Who's she, man? Who is she?
His eyes go even wider, and the little bit of color that was remaining in his face, leaving even more. And he whispers a single name. It was so quiet that you could barely hear it. Sarah. Zechariah Throckmorton and Matthew Higgins were in this small underground chamber, kneeling or standing above the skeleton of this woman. What were they doing at this moment?
Zechariah, puzzled, frustrated, but certain that he was right, begins casting around, plunging his fingers into the tangle of brittle bones, searching, scrabbling in the frozen earth. She's here, she's here, she's here somewhere, she's here. I heard it.
Matthew Higgins knelt down and put the skull in his hand and looked into its eyes for a moment, seeming to be searching for something.
As Matthew Higgins reached for the skull, touched it, the bone felt cold, but it felt also detached. And both the eyes of Zechariah Throckmorton and Matthew Higgins fell upon a shattered neck bone, damaged, nearly destroyed by some sort of heavy, sharp object.
It's the man. His guilt consumes him. He killed his wife. I think we should try to make our way out of here, Zechariah. There's nothing here but a sad story.
No. I heard it. She was here. She's here somewhere in this room. She's here.
My good man, if she can leave this room through the trapdoor without opening it, she could have left already. Listen to me. Why don't we go check on the horse? And Matthew, as he says that, he takes one of the finger bones and pockets it.
As Matthew does so, the air in his lungs grows colder, and he froze for a moment, froze in the pain, struggling to draw breath in this place, the finger bone slowly tumbling out through his own fingers, hitting the ground next to the skeleton.
On second thought, Zechariah, I say we go upstairs and ask Sir Francis for some more of his warming liquor. And Matthew attempts to leave the room.
The door opens, and you stared up. Matthew Higgins stared up onto the trapdoor from below. A little bit of blood was still seeping through. Some of it, as it was falling, was freezing into small red crystals hitting the ground like pebbles.
Why is it colder underground than above ground? And Matthew attempted to go up the ladder.
He did so, and he pushed open the trapdoor. What was Zechariah doing? Zechariah was left behind alone, in darkness, in fact, because Matthew Higgins had taken the lamp with him as he climbed up the ladder. What was Zechariah doing, alone? Or
Impervious to all around him, kneeling as the lamp retreated, leaving him in ever-growing, ever darker shadows. His bloodied fingertips clawed at the frozen ground. She's here. She's here. She's here. She's here. She's here.
Matthew Higgins made his way out, seeing the heavily injured figure of Benjamin Hartman lying across the entryway in a puddle of blood, seeing the faces of Arthur Scott and Sir Francis Nesbitt in the other room, shining in the firelight, but also he saw their breaths and his own. The cold from underground seemed to be seeping in to the house now. And it was becoming hard to breathe for all here.
Matthew Higgins looked for the wooden figurines and attempted to take them with him.
Matthew Higgins leapt across the form of Benjamin Hartman on the ground, and as he did so, a hand, bloody but still strong, clutched his leg, and another hand swung an axe, chopping into the leg. Did Matthew Higgins manage to evade the blow?
Ah! Matthew screamed and fell on his knees to the floor, his lamp scattering across the floor.
Breaking as the axe cut deep into muscle, cutting through some artery and stuck in bone, as the form of Benjamin Hartman grew still, and Matthew Higgins' heavily bleeding figure crashed to the ground, the lamp breaking and scattering. Matthew's eyes were going up and down, opening and closing, his mouth and lips trying to form words. The pain was terrible. The wound, the blood was steaming hot, but the wound, it was so terrible. Sir Francis Nesbitt and Arthur Scott saw that, and they realized that Matthew Higgins was dying. With his last breath, Benjamin Hartman had struck.
Dear
Take
God.
the toys, man.
Was
Take the toys and the candle. Get the horse. Get...
Arthur Scott just didn't move for what seemed for infinity. Then he finally said, "We need to leave now. This can't be. No, it can't be happening."
So Nesbitt looks around. I agree. Where's Zachariah? Is he still in the hole?
I assume so. I don't know.
So Nesbitt's torn, deciding whether he should abandon a man or go get him. Arthur, take the rifle and go hitch the horse to the wagon. I'll see if I can get Zachariah, but I'm not going to try too hard. And I'll be outside soon, and we will leave this place.
Arthur went and grabbed the rifle first, and then tried to.
Arthur's fingers closed around the rifle. The metal was so cold that it nearly bit into his flesh, and with a small shout of pain, he released it and it clattered onto the ground.
Forget the rifle. Arthur quickly went away from the rifle and tried to grab the still lit candle. Or
the candle was still lit, yes.
Yes. tried to grab the candle and use it as some light to go outside.
As Arthur tried the door, it opened only but an inch, and in the light of the candle, Arthur could see a shimmer of white and blue, a layer of ice that had grown on the outside of the door, freezing it, holding it in place. What was Sir Francis Nesbitt doing at that moment?
He was watching Arthur. As Sir Francis Nesbitt watched Arthur go to the door after dropping the gun, he realizes, to hell with Zachariah. Let's get the fuck out of here. And runs over to try to help get the door open.
Zachariah, alone in the darkness, his fingers and hands hurting even more and more as he was clawing at the frozen ground. He felt the cold now growing around him, growing more and more intense, and he felt himself going weaker, maybe blood loss, maybe just a cold, maybe something in his mind was about to give. What did he do?
Zechariah was struck by a sudden, strange, detached, peaceful sensation. And still humming the tune from the music box, he stopped his efforts, lay down next to the skeleton, and put his arms around it, and fell asleep.
The skeleton felt nearly warm, like flesh, not bone. And a warmth, like a blanket, settled across Zechariah Throckmorton as he closed his eyes in peace for the very last time. Arthur Scott and Sir Francis Nesbitt, struggling in the light of the dimming fireplace, their breath fogging the air, the steaming clouds of blood behind them in the cold, 2 dead bodies in the room. What were they doing?
Seeing that the front door has been iced over, Sir Francis runs to the back door in the room to see if he can open it.
As Sir Francis ran, jumped, and tried the back door, he found it frozen over in the same way. And he could also feel his strength being leached out by the cold, as if this last burst of speed had taken out nearly everything from him. What did he shout to Arthur?
Get out!
Arthur is still confused and scared, tries to just throw himself at the door to get it open somehow, and just with all his force.
Did he manage to break the ice and force the door open?
He did not.
He was too weak. He could feel his strength draining away. He pushed and smacked his shoulder against the door. He could feel the ice cracking, but it was not enough. He was stumbling, getting weaker, and he realized, both Sir Francis Nesbitt and Arthur Scott realized that this was their last moment. It was either escape or remain here forever. What did they do?
The cabin was built out of wood, right?
Yes.
Arthur looked at the candle in his hand and just held it against the wood, trying to light it on fire.
Did he manage to light the building on fire, the sturdy wooden wall with a single candle?
He was very.
We will see.
It was real. He did not. Not surprisingly.
A fire caught on the wood, but it was little. Not enough. Not even enough to warm Arthur's hands as he thrust them into the flame to find a little bit of warmth. But the only thing he found was pain, growing from the inside of his hand and the inside of his chest. And he could feel his lungs freezing, and he fell. Sir Francis Nesbitt, the last living being within these walls, stood at the back door. What did he do?
So Francis, realizing that the door is iced over, tries desperately to break the door off the frozen and to get out.
What did he use to break the ice? Just a sword?
No, grabbing his cane, he pulled on the handle to reveal a blade that he had kept hidden, and he tried to stab through the ice to break it to get out.
Did the blade serve him well?
It did not.
The blade, cold like death itself, stabbed into the ice, and with an awful crack, it shattered. A few pieces flying through the air, one of them slicing open Sir Francis Nesbitt's face. Blood, wonderfully warm, ran down his neck and chest. And for a brief moment, there was warmth, a sensation that Sir Francis Nesbitt thought he would never feel again. And he was right. He never would. And with that, the chapter was closed. 4 travelers had not reached Hollow Lake, and the cabin would be found a few months later, filled with bodies, strangely untouched by the weather and rot. The cabin was burned down by the villagers, the place forever marked as a place of evil. And no one dared to settle this clearing ever again. And that is the story of a walk in the woods. Don't walk in winter woods. That is all I can say. And with that, we are finished for tonight. That was our Halloween one-shot. I congratulate my players. They did really well, except for the end, I suppose. But it's part of a horror story, right? That everyone dies, sort of.
If we all died at the end, then it was a success.
Oh, I suppose so. You made it to the end, so that's something. So
Cool.
I had a lot of fun. That was great. I'm pretty sure I'll be running this system again. It's elegant and very interesting in its simplicity and the way it sort of gets out of hand towards the end. So I can only recommend it to everyone. It's like $5, I think, on DriveThruRPG. So if you want to get it, as I said, link below the video at the very bottom of the description. Feel free to check it out. Let me know what you think about it, if you do. And I hope we could summon up some atmosphere. A little bit of cold, a little bit of dark, a little bit of doubt, a little bit of fear. As much as you can these days over these electronic mediums that do not lend themselves too well. But I think my players did really well, and I'm very happy with how tonight ran. So I hope you had fun watching. As always, if you enjoyed our content, like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. The button is somewhere below, I'm sure. And we will be running more games in the future, talking about different game mastering stuff. And of course, if you want to join one of our games, feel free to message me on YouTube, Facebook, or Discord, or wherever, and we'll try to make something work. And until then, True Mask Game says, once again, thank you for my players, and to you, our esteemed watchers, which is also the name of the game master in this system, by the way, the Watcher, while the players are the Walkers. Anyway, thank you for watching. Good luck with your own games, and we will see you around. Good night, and enjoy your Halloween, or whatever day it is that you're watching this. Bye-bye.